Now is our time. Such a platitude has fallen from the lips of lords, kings, and emperors since mankind's earliest days. And all were wrong. Every fiefdom, kingdom, and empire to this day has collapsed, no matter how optimistic and mighty they might once have been. The greatest realm in all of humanity's history holds on to the very precipice, dangling over dark oblivion. Each passing day sees its grip weaken. It is but my task, my purpose, to tread upon its digits, and it will fall. Now is our time. Those who used these words had no idea what time really meant. Their arrogance and ignorance knew no bound. For that they were punished with death and destruction. But we know time. We know the warp. We know its currents, its waves, its flows, its tributaries. Our power is almost limitless. Our knowledge almost total. Behold the signs. The galaxy is cut in twain. Sortiarius is a bright light in the darkness of real space. Prospero, our home of old, has been reclaimed and is being rebuilt. We are in ascendancy, my sons. Never have we been stronger. Never has our foe been so weak. Those of humanity who have awakened, those I know to be the future of mankind, call for saviors, liberators, lords they can truly follow without question or doubt. We will provide that, and in turn, they will do what is necessary. Even now, I can sense their numbers growing, their yearnings to break their shackles strengthening, and their anger at their false overlords rising. I will call them to us, and they will come. When our labors are complete, the galaxy will tremble at our creation. Once we are unleashed, nothing will stop us. The false emperor will fall, and humanity will rise. Now, my sons, is truly our time, and forever shall it be so. Magnus the Red. Warhammer 40,000. Psychic Awakening. Ritual of the Damned. Magnus the Red has returned to the galaxy. This embittered demigod sees the winds of fate as they howl across the Imperium. He believes that humanity must reach its true potential, regardless of the monstrous cost. Within his twisted lair he schemes, but the Emperor's servants will see his foul works undone. The Emperor's domain has been cut in two, plunged into a level of disorder it has not known in thousands of years. An ever-fluctuating belt of warp storms lies across the galaxy, so that it resembles the eviscerated stomach of a mortally wounded prey animal. Though the Great Rift is a terror to mankind, to some of their foes it represents opportunities unbounded. For vengeance, for power, and for the completion of goals set 10,000 years in the past. After devastating the Fenris system, home to his old enemies the Space Wolves, Magnus the Red brought the planet of the Sorcerous into real space. Were this threat not dire enough for the Imperium, Magnus also reclaimed his old homeworld of Prospero, ruined millennia ago by Leman Russ and his sons. The Space Wolves did not fight alone against Magnus and his 1,000 sons. The Grey Knights and Dark Angel chapters fought by their side, although millennia-old enmities nearly brought the would-be allies to blows. Despite their differences, the defenders of humanity prevented Fenris's total destruction, and, with Magnus's hand revealed, the threat he poses is now at least visible to the beleaguered Imperium. The Grey Knights and Dark Angels stand ready to counter any moves the Cyclops makes. The Dark Angels suffered more than any others know, fighting Tzeentch's fell servants are eager for revenge. The Grey Knights remain vigilant, knowing that the Crimson King no doubt has set in motion plans to bring about his insane visions for humanity's future. Fate of the Damned. The emergence of the Great Rift, whilst inflicting untold misery on the Imperium, was a boon joyously welcomed by many of the Emperor's enemies. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons were no exception, and the Crimson King wasted no time in formulating new schemes and strategies to bring about his evil ends. In the wake of the Great Rift's opening, the servants of Chaos enjoyed a freedom that had hitherto been unfathomable to even the most ambitious, fanatical, and twisted amongst them. Demons ran rampant on Imperial worlds, and entire systems were cut off from the rest of the galaxy, as vulnerable as a sea creature beached alone upon the shore. The winds of the Imperium had never blown more strongly, and the followers of the god Tzeentch imbibed them deeply and hungrily. Upon all of this, Magnus the Red smiled, his mind working over every exciting possibility brought about by the new reality. Sorcerers in their hundreds carried out his will with a new level of vigor, whether they knew it or not. They raised vast armies and hunted down treasures older than the Imperium itself. They sought out lore forbidden, hidden, and suppressed, a terrifying amount of which lay practically unguarded amidst the mayhem and disorder that beset much of the galaxy. After 10,000 years of absence, Magnus returned to Prospero, the world upon which he had been raised. Though the planet was in utter ruin following its devastation 10 millennia ago, Magnus began the process of restoring it to a level of magnificence beyond anything the masters of old, who mentored him as a youth, could have dreamed. He started with its vast librariums, collating knowledge and wisdom both old and new in towers that glowed with brilliant ever-changing colours. He rediscovered treasures that evaded even the most skilled of those who scoured Prospero for relics and caches of hidden texts, and with these he planned to grow the strength of the 1,000 Sons to levels impossible for any foe to overcome. Even as this great work of reconstruction continued apace, Magnus turned his Cyclopean eye upon the wider galaxy, and beheld a phenomenon he had long wished for. The Cicatrix Maledictum heralded an unforeseen growth in human psychic potential, something Magnus had wished humanity to explore without restriction since the Great Crusade. With the Imperium on its knees, Magnus knew that this was his time. Nothing would stop him. The Grey Knights. Few in the Imperium were as aware of the new threats that assailed humanity as the Space Marines of the Grey Knights chapter. No force that had ever been raised by mankind could meet the threat of the daemon in the way the Grey Knights could, and in their millennia of existence they had saved countless worlds from cataclysmic invasions, contained explosions of unreality, and cast incalculable numbers of demons back into the hell from which they came. Never, at any point in the chapter's long and noble history, had their homeworld of Titan been so thinly garrisoned. Virtually all its military might was dispatched on campaign in a valiant attempt to restore and maintain order across the Imperium, making haste from one world to the next without thought of recovery or rearmament besides that which could be achieved on the move. The cavernous halls and long corridors of the chapter's fortress monastery were as silent as the grave. Training weapons gathered dust on racks, untouched for months or even years. Maintenance chambers, normally alive with activity, were almost entirely dormant. There was but one part of the Citadel of Titan that did not appear completely abandoned. In the Chamber of Trials, home of chapter recruitment and training, more neophytes than ever before underwent the incredibly arduous process of becoming a Grey Knight. As the number of people with emergent psychic abilities grew across humanity's galactic realm, so did the Grey Knight's recruitment pool expand. It was a phenomenon of which they took full advantage. Never before had new recruits been more needed, for the chapter fought across many war zones and their casualties mounted upon dozens of battlefields. Though the threat was great, the Grey Knights were determined to meet it. The Dark Angels. When the Great Rift tore across the galaxy, the Dark Angels on the Rock, the chapter's vast asteroidal fortress monastery, found themselves caught in the region of space that became known as the Imperium Nihilis. There they fought war after war, battling for their very existence against the arch-enemy. The Rock itself was tainted by the presence of demonic hordes, which maimed and killed indiscriminately. Hundreds of Dark Angels and warriors of their successor chapters were slain by traitors in the Darkmoor massacre. With the terrible engagements in the Fenris system imprinted firmly in their minds, the sons of Caliban clashed with the diabolic forces of the Changeling and the Thousand Sons in the Stygius sector. Throughout this time, the librarians were racked with visions. Some suddenly fell to their knees, clutching their heads in agony as they screamed in the middle of pre-battle briefings, training exercises, or private meditations. Others did not wake from terrible nightmares that dragged on painfully for days on end. Every report given to Ezekiel, Grand Master of Librarians, told of drops of rain developing in vast deluges that drowned entire worlds, or sparks growing into planet-wide firestorms. It seemed that, despite mankind's newfound power, it was even more vulnerable to the predations of the warp and its foul denizens. The visions foretold the demise of the Imperium among thousands of psychic cataclysms, which was sobering indeed. Let our world be a beacon of hope. Let it be shelter for the weary exile. Let it be salvation for the falsely damned. Let it be home for the lost. Let it be here every forgotten soul can fulfill its true purpose. Magnus the Red. Planet of the Sorcerers. The planet of the Sorcerers has been the Thousand Sons' base of operations for 10,000 years. After a ritual fueled by the death of 1 billion souls, it was ripped from its place in the warp and brought into Imperial space. A nightmare world also known as Sortiarius, the mere sight of the planet of the Sorcerers can drive mortals insane. It is a warped place populated by the demonic, the abominable, and the evil. Although the planet now orbits a star, the hues of its skies change at random, bearing no resemblance to a pattern of seasons. Featureless plains of glass constantly changing mazes of twisted mirrors and swamps of mutating flesh adorn its landscape. Its ground is struck by sourceless lightning storms, and the biting wind that race across its surface rage with the screams of tortured souls. Despite Sortarius' hellscape, which renders it inimical to normal life, these creatures born out of Tzeentch's crazed imagination thrive on the planet. Packs of Zangors hunt among razor-sharp crags, and jungles made up of the twisted forms of failed devotees. Roaming demon engines lumber across storm-racked plains of crystal, preying upon one another in their own ecosystem. Rampaging horrors, screamers and flamers pop randomly into existence or appear through spontaneously opening portals, slaughtering or mutating all they find before evaporating as quickly as they arrived. Among all these beings live the Chaos Spawn, terrifying beasts as pitiable as they are repulsive to those who have some understanding of their genesis. The tides of warp energy that drench the planet of the Sorcerers make the world itself a weapon in the hands of Magnus and the Sorcerers of the Thousand Sons. To them, its very surface is malleable, and for rivals and invaders alike, every step upon it can be more dangerous than walking the densest minefield. Swarms of gibbering demons are summoned at will by the planet's masters. Entire topographical features grow or die in moments, denying foes valuable cover or trapping them in places while whole sects of thousand-sunned warriors are teleported to the most advantageous attacking positions. Yet for an enemy even to set foot on the planet of the Sorcerers, they must be either extremely powerful or permitted to land by the Thousand Suns, though the latter very often leads to a worse fate. Invisible conjurations surround the planet, sucking any munitions fired upon it into the warp and dissipating powerful lasers into harmless rays of light. Illusory hexes cause attackers to believe that their weapons have hit their target when they have, in fact, proved wayward. Portals absorb city-leveling barrages and turn them back on the firers. Other spells and enchantments cause weapons to detonate while still on board attacking ships, or imitate the warp drives of enemy vessels, hurling them into the Imperium without shielding. Magnus has had one world destroyed by invaders before. He will not allow it to happen again, and is rarely satisfied by simply warding off the foe. Plans in motion. With Prospero and Sortiarius finally united around his home star, Magnus began the next stage of his plans. Storming the Stygius sector with a colossal host, he seized a multitude of worlds across several systems. With these takings, he had the beginnings of a second empire. On the other side of the Cicatrix Maledictum to Prospero and Sortarius, Magnus also demanded that his scattered sons, many of whom had been fighting across the galaxy independently for millennia, be reunited. The Rahati, most powerful of the Thousand Sons, were set this task, and though many did not answer their summons, nearly a dozen sects were ritually reunited with Legion and Primarch. The sorcerers commanding each sect were welcomed with open arms before being gunned down in duplicitous attacks. Magnus had no interest in suffering their potential rebellions, and wanted them punished for not serving him loyally over the previous 10,000 years. Magnus also recognized that to rebuild his legion's numbers, he needed mortal followers. Pondering conditions within the Imperium, he knew that his fellow Psychers, the men and women he believed to represent the future of the human race, were everywhere persecuted, exploited, or purged. Magnus envisioned his realm to be a haven from this, a sanctuary for those the Imperium would target, alienate, and destroy, and a place from which the superior would begin their war to overthrow the inferior. Thus he sent upon the warp a siren call to those with psychic ability. Such a song would promise them safety, learning, and acceptance, if they would only come to the Crimson King. These followers would not only make the Thousand Sons even more powerful, they would also form a society the likes of which Magnus had always imagined for mankind. Magnus knew that there would be a high price. Not all would survive the perilous journey. Not all would have the intellect and mental robustness needed to handle the kind of power that would become available to them. For some, their purpose would be the horror of becoming a ritual sacrifice, the ultimate form of service to Legion and to Tzeentch. Others would become the privileged hosts of bound demons. These people would never get to enjoy the beauty that Magnus would create, but it was a cost deemed entirely worthwhile. These were but minor steps when compared to what Magnus envisioned for the galaxy at large. Even though more and more humans were being born with psychic power, and those who already possessed it saw their capabilities swell, for Magnus this was not enough. The history of mankind is full of individuals who led their people out of backward times and into the future. Magnus planned to be the one to lead humanity to its ultimate potential, the final deliverer of the human race to what he saw as its destiny. Burying himself in texts and lore that had been indecipherable to him 10 millennia before, he found new meaning in strange symbols and forgotten languages. After all his learning in the Eye of Terror, he could now read them like a native tongue. In this way, he learned of a ritual that could accelerate humanity's psychic surge 100-fold across an entire sector. Without hesitation, he had ordered each of the Rahati to supply a cadre of sorcerers to invoke the necessary incantations which gather 999 volunteer mortals for the required sacrifice. I see an ardent warrior, a fight eternal, a never-fading hope, lost in the empiric tides, a wanderer never forgotten but seldom seen. He stands before a Cyclopean king, defiant, but with dread in his soul. Lucian Adantor, Prognosticator. Sons of Titan. The Grey Knights have guarded the Imperium from chaos for 10,000 years. An elite brotherhood, they are some of the most mysterious of the Emperor's warriors. Few know of their existence, and those who do know little of the truth. The Speculum Infernus, an archaic device of mysterious provenance held on Titan, had remained silent for years. This pleased the prognosticators, those of the Grey Knights responsible for tracking demonic incursions. As the last time the device had spun into life, it had foreshadowed Magnus the Red's return to the galaxy, the devastation of the Fenris system, and the loss of scores of Grey Knights warriors who had battled against the Crimson King's hordes. As dark as those days were, the Imperium's fortunes had worsened even further since. Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade had been more effective than any of his campaigns prior. Cadia, long the gatekeeper holding back the Wardmaster, had been destroyed, leading to the cataclysmic emergence of the Great Rift. Hundreds of worlds have fallen. Some were drowned in deluges of warp-spawned horrors that massacred all in their path, while many others fell to faithless rebellion or collapsed under the weight of traitor assaults. Throughout, the followers of Chaos slaughtered and enslaved unimaginable numbers. The Astronomicon had been temporarily extinguished and, even once its light had been restored to the region, now designated the Imperium Sanctus, thousands of Imperial worlds remained cut off in the darkness beyond the rift. The Grey Knights were stretched thin. Their warriors raced to meet threats along the entire length of the Cicatrix Maledictum. Planets too tainted to save were purged in their entirety, with billions slain to prevent the spread of chaos. Hordes of demons were broken and their diabolic masters banished back into the warp. Many worlds and their peoples were saved thanks to the Grey Knights' bravery and initiative, although very few citizens would ever learn anything of their mysterious saviors. Throughout all of this, the Sons of Titan kept an ever-vigilant watch over the Sorcerous system, home of the Thousand Suns homeworld of Prospero. They had failed to prevent Sortiarius' manifestation in that forbidden region, and were determined not to fail again. All felt a burning desire to see the blasphemous presence utterly annihilated. It was known to all of the Grey Knights that the longer Magnus was able to maintain his monstrous grip on the region, the more powerful he would grow. 1,000,001 fiendish schemes surely flowed through his mind, and the fruition of any one of them would be a terrible bane to the Imperium. The Grey Knights knew perhaps more than any others the truth of the Imperium's frailty. Should Magnus continue his efforts unmolested, the Emperor's domain might never recover. That the Demon Primarch would attempt to rebuild his legion was seen as inevitable, and the Grand Masters agreed that the Crimson King was capable of much worse. The message that Magnus had dispatched along the currents of the warp, calling to those with psychic gifts, had not escaped the Grey Knights' attention. Each of their brothers had heard it in his own way. Having passed through the rituals of detestation, not one son of Titan was persuaded by Magnus's beguiling propaganda. Had the portents of the message not been so dire and as obviously appealing to the untainted and vulnerable mortals for whom it was intended, some of the Grey Knights might even have deemed it unworthy of their attention. Magnus's amassing of followers only confirmed the Grey Knights' suspicions that it was cold inevitability that the Speculum Infernus span into life again. The prognosticators gave their interpretation of the omens revealed, and few Grey Knights were surprised by what they heard. With the empiric balance thrown into tumult across a vast swathe of space across the Sorcerous system, demonic incursions plagued multiple systems, where still the Speculum Infernus indicated a growing dark power on Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers. However, what crimes the Crimson King was planning and committing, it was impossible to determine. Such was the strength of the arcane shroud that veiled much of the Prosperan rift. Nevertheless, the prognosticators advised Grandmaster Voldus that this threat be investigated in force. Voldus agreed. The Grandmaster selected Brother Captain Arvin Stern and the Third Brotherhood to be the focal point of the task force that would bring war to Magnus and the planet of the Sorcerers. Stern and his warriors had fought the Crimson King and his host of traitors, mutants and demons before. They yearned to finally exorcise Magnus's baleful presence and earn redemption for failing to prevent him from achieving his aims in the Fenris system. A number of paladins and purifiers were attached to Stern's command, their unique skills and experience deemed essential to a strike into the heart of Magnus's realm. But even with these forces, both Voldus and Stern knew that the staggering power of a Grey Knight's Brotherhood was not enough to defeat Magnus on his own home world. Aid would be needed to ensure victory. After many hours of discussion and ruminations, it was agreed that Stern would approach the Dark Angels. Few know of the Grey Knight's existence, and fewer still have the strength to aid them in their fight. Stern had fought alongside the Dark Angels at Fenris, however, and had witnessed their implacable resolve and fury in battle firsthand. He knew that they had too much cause to seek vengeance against the Thousand Sons in their Primarch, recalling that the two sides had clashed in the horrendous conflict of the Stygius sector. The Dark Angels were bloodied, angry and determined. Grandmaster Voldus had initially cautioned against such an alliance, citing the Dark Angels' untrustworthy nature. Stern too held misgivings, but argued that fighting alongside the secretive sons of Caliban would only give the Grey Knights greater insight into their manner of making war. With the decision made, a choir of dozens of Titans' most powerful astropaths was gathered to send the Grey Knights' missive to the Rock. Sons of Caliban. Somber and serious, the Dark Angels are a secretive brotherhood, a first founding chapter that have defended the Imperium since the fabled times of the Great Crusade, but their history is not an entirely noble one. Thus they deem both themselves and their successors the unforgiven, and fight endlessly for redemption. The Dark Angels chapter that the Grey Knight's message eventually reached was a shaken one. Reports told of the fallen mustering in numbers previously thought impossible. The Rock, once thought inviolable, had been befouled by not one but two demonic invasions, and the fact that the first of these had only been resisted with the aid of the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights brought the Dark Angels great shame. When Reboot Gilliman had returned, Grandmaster Azrael had feared the worst, that the secret the Unforgiven had kept for 10,000 years would finally be their undoing. He had been wrong. As the Primarch Reborn had been plunged into a war of such scale that even he lacked the time to research their history. Instead, a new problem had surfaced, the Primaris Space Marine reinforcements sent by Gilliman. Whilst having the Lion's gene seed and bearing Dark Angel colours, had not gone through the chapter's initiations, and were thought to represent an extreme security risk. The words, "Colours doth not a Dark Angel make," were not uncommonly heard amongst the rank-and-file battle brothers on the Rock. Nonetheless, the Primaris Space Marines performed exceptionally well in battle, and Azrael faced the nagging question of when one would be initiated into the inner circle. As the fate had it, the decision was made for him in a manner he had not expected. Master Lazarus of the 5th Company and members of the Deathwing had been mortally wounded in the Stygius sector. In response, apothecaries and librarians with access to Archmagos Coral's technology had borne him across the Rubicon Primaris, deeming it the only way to save his life. Even a dreadnought chassis would have been insufficient. Lazarus and the battered remnants of his company had fought in the Stygius sector for many months against the change hosts of Tzeentch that threatened to overrun that vast region of space, until finally they returned to the Rock for rearmament, repair and reinforcement. Scant days after the 5th Company's return, one of the Rock's astropathic choirs received a message. For hours they convulsed and writhed as their bodies were flooded with agony. Only one of their number retained any kind of consciousness, and several were driven insane before being given the Emperor's mercy. The astropath that still stood was thrust before Azrael, Ezekiel, and Lazarus, the only Dark Angel's senior officers present on the Rock. She was a quivering wreck, too weak to even hold her staff. It clattered to the marble floor, the echoes reverberating around the cold council chamber as she collapsed to her knees. Azrael asked her what she saw, and her response moved randomly between mutters, stammers, and ravings. She spoke of a winged monarch, a devastated world reborn, the 6th planet, boulders made of eyes, obelisks of crystal, monsters, demons, nightmares, a shield of ivory and crimson, golems of blue, red, and gold, the Ouroboros, a warped tomb pierced with a sword of silver, a terrifying sense of doom, burning hatred and ominous, eager anticipation. It took the officers hours to agree on an interpretation of what the astropath saw. Though they could not be sure, it appeared that the Grey Knights had discovered something about Magnus, the Thousand Suns, and the planet of the Sorcerers. Lazarus had seen what horrors those traitors had inflicted upon the Fenris system, and hated them for it. They had transformed parts of the studious sector into a stuff of nightmares, slaying scores of his warriors. He declared that he would heed the Grey Knight's call. Magnus would bleed. Azrael and Ezekiel had doubts, however. Why would the Grey Knights summon them, especially after the events in the Fenris system? What had the Sons of Titan gleaned from their time upon the Rock? What did their psychic intuitions detect of the Fortress Monastery's dark history whilst fighting within it? What mysteries might they wish to explore and solve in their ceaseless mission against the arch-enemy? Azrael was not immune to the desire for revenge, however. Only he knew just how deeply the forces of chaos had struck the Rock, and what the Changeling had done. Nor could he forget the Grey Knight's actions in keeping his chapter's Fortress Monastery secure. Neither he nor Ezekiel were completely surprised by what they heard. The Unforgiven had been sharing information with their brothers about the galaxy's events and the wars they had waged. Of late, many anomalous events and patterns of unusual psychic activity had been reported. If the Unforgiven had identified this, it was impossible that a creature with the immense intelligence and psychic power of Magnus had not also observed it. What foul acts the Crimson King could commit with such phenomena occurring in the galaxy now none dared guess. What was certain was that those acts had to be prevented from coming to fruition. Azrael knew that he could not leave the message unanswered, but nor could he ignore the dangers posed by working closely with the Grey Knights. Thus he decided that Lazarus and his 5th Company would respond, but they would not go alone. A complement of Deathwing and Ravenwing would also join the strike force, their orders being, in part, to assess whether the Sons of Titan knew anything at all of Caliban's secrets. The emptying of Tizca. The Dark Angels made all haste to Sortiarius. What they would find they had little idea. Would the Grey Knights already be in orbit, awaiting them? Would they find the Sons of Titan destroyed by the fell magics of Magnus and his sorcerers? Regardless, they would not leave without victory. With each passing day, the Dark Angel's journey through the warp grew more arduous. The Seeker of Redemption's navigator was exhausted to the point of near death. Lazarus ordered the Seeker out of the warp. It was during this period of enforced rest that the Grey Knight strike cruiser Purging Sword translated from warp space and hove alongside the Dark Angel's ship. How the warriors of Titan had located them in the vast gulfs of space remained a mystery to the Dark Angels. But after a tense exchange coloured by suspicion and the threat of violence, the Grey Knights were cautiously welcomed as allies. Both Lazarus and Stern agreed that their strike must be quick and decisive, and that the Grey Knights' skills were uniquely suited to halting the ritual. Fierce resistance was guaranteed, and a straightforward military victory could not be achieved. They had to focus on ending the ritual at all costs. Desiring to bleed the Thousand Suns, but fully aware of the strategic situation, Lazarus saw an opportunity. The Dark Angels had identified a temple complex that was a source of power, preventing orbital bombardments of the planet. Lazarus's forces would launch an assault on it in an effort to draw defenders out from Tizca, the old prosperous city transported to Sortiarius millennia ago. Doing so would provide the Grey Knights with the opening they needed to strike the ritual. Destroying the temple complex would be a victory, but weakening Tizca's defenses was the true goal. As soon as the Adeptus Astartes vessels entered real space in the Prospero system, they began their attack runs. Their engines flared brilliantly as they raced to the planet of the Sorcerers at maximum speed. Dark Angels and Grey Knights warriors were lashed into the restraint harness of gunships or stood ready in teleportarums. Not a second was to be wasted. Dozens of gunships burst from the Seeker's hangar bays, zooming towards the planet below in loose formation. Though they engaged in desperate evasive maneuvers, no gunship escaped the world's defensive fire unscathed. The Ravenwing and Deathwing formed a reserve, ready to deliver the killing blow the moment Lazarus ordered. Once they reached the surface, Dark Angels leapt from moving gunships before the flyers pulled up into the skies to provide overwatch. The Space Marines found themselves amongst jagged grey rocks in the outskirts of a huge ritual space. The terrain, dotted with ravines and crags, withering tentacles of azure, maroon, and fuchsia, wriggled between gaps in the boulders, and bewitching midnight black eyes leered from bulbous growths among multi-coloured crystals as sharp as power weapons. The Fifth Company swiftly hacked the sentient tentacles down and burst the ocular lumps with bolter shells. Their target lay in the near distance, a pyramid of emerald-tinted glass surrounded by a ring of 9 rune-engraved obelisks of crimson stone. Looking to the east, the Dark Angels could see that the Tizca's vast metamorphic structures, their summits towering high above the city's enormous walls. It was only when the Fifth Company arrayed themselves in assault formation that the Thousand Suns and their allies struck, having poured out of Tizca. Vast shoals of wind-riding demons blotted out the planet's sun, moving in perfect unison through the skies as savage helldrakes darted among them. Packs of baroque demon engines stampeded forwards, chaotic hordes of Zangor braying for blood in their wake. At the very core of the host were thrall bands from the Thousand Suns cults, ornately armoured rubricae gleaming with unholy light. The Dark Angels responded. Anti-air tanks cycled their cannon before flooding the tortured skies with shot. Battle line squads took up advanced positions, opening fire at oncoming foes while still moving on their objective. Fire support squads locked on to the most heavily armoured targets before unleashing blasts of superheated plasma and beams of devastating energy. Still, few plans survived contact with the enemy, and even fewer against a foe as conniving as the Thousand Suns. Squads firing on the attacking rubricae saw their enemies vanish, only to be teleported behind them by their sorcerous lords. With jump packs roaring, the Dark Angels that leapt to engage Zangor murder packs found themselves overwhelmed by the spontaneous appearance of living flames that bit and lashed with fangs and talons. Even the planet itself turned against them, with tentacles thought neutered, regrowing at rapid speed and crushing unsuspecting marines like empty ammunition boxes. For all of these challenges, the Dark Angels fought on with characteristic resolve. The las cannons of Devastators and rumbling battle tanks destroyed demon engine after demon engine, as aggressors scythed down hundreds of deranged cultists with furious hails of fire. Though they had doubtless drawn a great many foes from Tizca, Lazarus could see the painful slowness of his warriors' advance. They would have to move quickly to bring down the temple. When Brother Estriel's sarcophagus was torn open by a pair of deranged hellbrutes, his mortal remains ripped out and set alight by giggling horrors, Lazarus ordered the Ravenwing and Deathwing into battle. The Deathwing Terminators teleported into action almost instantaneously, unleashing a storm of firepower as soon as they materialized. They cleared swathes of demons and cultists and gave the Dark Angels new impetus. Thunderhawk gunships burst through the crowds of screamers, heavy bolters glowing with heat as they launched torrents of rounds into the demonic flocks. Ravenwing fighters engaged in fierce acrobatic duels with winged demon engines that breathed gouts of warp flame. Below, bikers roared from the lowered ramps of Thunderhawks, firing their bolters before even striking the ground. But this counterattack was not invulnerable to the Thousand Suns' witchcraft. One Deathwing squad materialized over a mystically created bottomless chasm, the veterans falling to an inglorious death. Ravenwing bikers pursuing fleeing Zangor suddenly found themselves directly in the sights of merciless Sekhmet Terminators, the quarry having vanished. Even with the arrival of powerful reinforcements, Lazarus could see they were losing. The temple's pyramids did not seem any closer, but a trio of dark talons broke from their pursuers and raced towards it. One was shot down, even as its rift cannon charged, the wreck crashing to the ground. The remaining pair opened fire on the pyramid's crystalline apex, their weapons' devastating beams scorching its surface and disrupting its energies. What damage this dealt was impossible to determine, but it was clear the Dark Angel's primary objective was achieved. Vast hosts had vacated Tisca to engage Lazarus's warriors, and they had been bled deeply. All the Dark Angels could now do was hold until they received word from the Grey Knights that victory was won. Lazarus ordered a fighting withdrawal to buy more time and draw more foes from Tisca. At long last, the transmission came. The Dark Angels, badly mauled and low on ammunition, finally began their extraction. It was only after a grueling fight through the Tisca's defences, once most of their gunships were aboard the Seeker, that they learned to their horror that the Grey Knights were urgently hailing for aid. The Dark Angels had been deceived. The plunging of the sword. With the Dark Angels launching their attack to draw Magnus's forces away, the Grey Knights prepared to teleport deep into Tisca's heart. Each brother steeled his soul against the madness they would face and horrors they would need to vanquish. If they failed here, the evil unleashed would consume an entire sector. The Grey Knights' landing was unopposed. Squads materialized, nemesis weapons flaring and guns primed, but all was eerily silent. They were in a round plaza, from which 9 grand avenues split off. Brother Captain Stern spat at the sight of the place's ornate decoration. Though hatred coursed through his veins at the blasphemy all around, the site would serve as their place of retreat should such it be required, its open space being suitable for gunship landing. The immense evil of the plaza pressed down upon the minds of the Grey Knights, the librarians most of all. The root of the ritual was obvious to them. To merely look in its direction was to invite incredible psychic pain. But they were Grey Knights all, and would never let such a petty concern as pain prevent them from confronting the arch-enemy and carrying out their mission. It wasn't long before their foe struck. Multicolored mobs of daemons with flailing tentacles and limbs hooked and giggled as they tossed sorcerous bolts of warp energy at the Grey Knights. Creatures that defied mortal understanding hopped across the memorial flooring at frightening speed, hurling gouts of flame of every colour and hue, and none. The Grey Knights raced to meet them, firing torrents of blessed ammunition from consecrated weapons. But such was the fury of the demons' attack that no effort could secure the plaza as a landing zone. Realizing this, Stern ordered all of his warriors to make for the ritual site. The Grey Knights pushed on through Tisca's narrow streets, passing pyramid shrines and bronze statues littered with rotting offerings, obelisks of sapphire and ruby, whose surfaces resembled rippling oceans, and sphinxes whose penetrating eyes seemed to follow a warrior wherever he moved. Warriors in Terminator plate led the way, their thick armor bearing the brunt of the punishing demonic attacks. Purgation squads followed close behind, their massed heavy weapons fire blowing away the dense knots of demons, and creating space for the Brotherhood to push into. But for all the Grey Knights' grim determination, peerless equipment, and unquenchable resolve, their foes fought hard. while others were mutated beyond recognition by warping flames or dragged down by cavorting horrors that bit and tore at the minute weak points in the Space Marine's armor. The Grey Knights cut a red path through the labyrinthine streets, but despite their ferocity they found themselves repeatedly arriving in the very same plaza in which they had started, no matter which route they took. Only the power of Magnus himself could deceive the Grey Knights in such a way. Vital time had been lost. Knowing that this trickery had to be undone, Stern rallied his librarians to him. They warned that the power required to break the sorcery was incredibly dangerous and would only attract more foes, but Stern knew they had no choice. As the librarians formed a loose circle and began their ritual, they felt the tides of the warp shift in strange, unexpected ways. Reality at the center of the circle shattered, and a shimmering portal appeared, its light almost blinding them. Kaldor Drago strode out of it, raising the Titan sword aloft. His lips moved rapidly, the words impossible to hear over the sounds of battle, but their effects impossible not to see. All around the Grey Knights, Magnus's spells lifted, and the true face of the plaza was revealed. Proud columns were in fact piles of broken rubble. Pristine mosaics were shattered or defiled. Breathtaking frescoes were roughly daubed over with unholy symbols and blasphemous images. Call for angels. With the spell lifted, the Grey Knights wasted no time in pushing through yet more winding streets toward the ritual site. But their efforts were met by even more furious attack by Magnus's 1,000 sons and their mortal followers. The Grey Knights punched through rows of old hab blocks to outflank Rubricae and Zangors. They cut down squad leaders and heavy weapons specialists to spread disorder and reduce any advantage the enemy had. Still, the Grey Knights kept moving, fighting running battles and psychic duels with every step. Despite the Dark Angel's efforts, the enemy numbers were still immense. More than one Grey Knight brother muttered of the unreliability of their so-called allies, convinced that the Dark Angels could not possibly have been carrying out their mission. Others questioned whether the sons of Caliban even lived. Stern realized that, for all their might, the Grey Knights could not succeed here alone. They needed to combine their forces with the Dark Angels. It was a bitter truth for any son of Titan to acknowledge, but there was little choice. The Grey Knights made vox call after vox call. With each failure they cursed more fiercely, as the silver lines of their warriors grew thinner under constant attack. The Grey Knights knew that psychic communication would be next to impossible on a world such as this, but the tides of the warp ebbed and flowed so strongly. As the battle raged, Stern desperately sought after any means to contact the Dark Angels while his forces continued to push towards the ritual site. One of his interceptor squads identified an empiric amplifier that would have the potential to boost the psychic signal. Stern seized the opportunity and redirected his brotherhood. Dread Knights grappled with avian greater demons, as Grey Knights with personal teleporters outmaneuvered columns of Rubricae. Purifiers incinerated crazed cultists as gunships made daring strafing runs against rampaging demon engines. 1,000-son sorcerer with a cadre, as Sekhmet Terminator bodyguards held the amplifier, a large nonagonal diamond hovering in the center of an elevated platform. Leading a squad of paladins, Stern charged into combat. A clash of minds as well as blade ensued as the Grey Knights were assailed by illusions and hexes. Many paladins fell, their armor pierced by ensorcelled coppish blades, or their flesh contorted beyond reason by the sorcerer's malignant powers. Regardless, they fought on, bringing down their foes one by one. When Stern finally beheaded the sorcerer, the battle was won. With the amplifier secured, the remaining Grey Knight librarians tapped into its powerful energies in an attempt to reach the Dark Angel's own librarians, their minds scrabbling for their quarry like the hands of a blind man who has lost his cane. Almost any other psycho would have been struck down by such efforts, but not so the Grey Knight librarians. At last, they reached the Dark Angel's librarian Baraquiel, a master of the obscuration discipline, and learned that the sons of Caliban believed victory already won, claiming they had heard as much from brother Captain Stern himself. Even as Baraquiel spoke, The Dark Angel's withdrawal was nearing completion. Stern was incensed. The trickery of their foe knew no bounds. The Grey Knights needed the Dark Angels now. The conversing librarian suggested the use of a temporary corridor through the warp to link the two forces, large enough for their armoured vehicles. Such an effort would almost certainly kill the librarians, but might enable much of the Dark Angel forces to unite with the Grey Knights for a final strike against Magnus's ritual. Stern agreed. No sacrifice was too great. Knights and angels. The librarians' heroic sacrifice made it possible for Lazarus's forces to cease their withdrawal and unite with Brother Captain Stern's Grey Knights. With all haste, the combined Space Marine host launched a final desperate assault to break the Thousand Suns ritual. Few thought survival possible, but still they fought on. The combined Dark Angels and Grey Knights force made significant progress. Dark Angels' vanguard squads traced a route through hellish forge fanes. They escorted thundering battle tanks that scoured the way clear of innumerable cultists, Zangors, and demonic horrors, leaving a trail of frothed blood, scattered corpses, and steaming ichor in their wake. During brutal, close-quarters fighting, they forced a path through the sprawling barrack complexes of Old Tisca's ancient soldiery. With each step closer to the ritual, every psyker among the Space Marines felt greater and greater pressure on their minds, suffering deep, throbbing pain in their skulls. Even those without psychic power began to feel the strain, the fell energies emanating from the ritual site like needles pricking at their minds. The Adeptus Astartes were beset by every kind of illusion, hex, and spell. Though the warding incantations of the Grey Knights stopped many of these before they could take their dreadful effect, by their sheer number many broke through. Pink and blue fire buffeted the Space Marines with deadly bolts of roiling energy. Rubrique, striding in plain sight, became invisible, impossible to target. Stern and Lazarus fought back to back, striking down foe after foe. When they reached the ritual site, the Adeptus Astartes saw its true scale for the first time. Magnus himself conducted the malign ceremony, standing on a colossal, ornately carved rostrum, with an entourage of sorcerers surrounding him. In a plaza many times larger than that which the Grey Knights had arrived in, countless thousands of Magnus's followers cheered in adoration as hundreds of sacrificial victims were put to the knife. Their corpses filled a great pit, the released heat of them hazing the air. There were so many dead that each priest had a pile of discarded sacrificial knives that had been blunted by the tracheas of those slain. Lazarus knew that to simply fight their way through to those conducting the ritual would not be possible. Instead, he ordered his Dark Angels to open fire on Magnus. Slaying the demon Primarch would surely be the greatest victory of all, and would end the ritual. But Magnus contemptuously shrugged off the attacks, and any fire directed at the ritual of the Sorcerers failed in the same way. Meanwhile, Dark Angels and Grey Knights fought side by side, warriors of the two orders killing and bleeding together against tides of Magnus's followers, who were now alerted to Adeptus Astartes' presence. The last remaining gunships and fighters of both chapters pushed their engines to their limit in ferocious aerial combat, to clear the skies of Zangor razor-winged demons and Chiropteran demon engines. Some were destroyed, their burning wrecks crashing into Tzeentchian hordes below in one final act of defiant heroism. As brother after brother fell, Stern knew there was little more than they could do. Nothing less than an orbital bombardment could end the ritual at this point. The Crimson King and his armies were too powerful. He ordered all of the remaining Adeptus Astartes aircraft to withdraw from the skies in the hope that some of their number would survive the battle. Stern and his remaining warriors combined with Kaldor Drago's immense psychic presence to act as a beacon for the purging swords, lance batteries, and macro cannons. Amid all the psychic white noise and contradictory readings that plagued every psych auger and auspex aboard the Grey Knight's vessel, the blazing white light of the Grey Knight's aegis shone through. Only Drago had the psychic strength to reach out to their minds of the gunnery officers on board to order them to fire. If such action cost all of the Grey Knights their lives, it would be worth it to stop the ritual. The Purgeon's sword unleashed its salvos. Such was their speed that Magnus barely had time to conjure a psychic barrier for his personal protection before the lance beams and macro cannon rounds struck. The blasts instantly annihilated tens of thousands in all directions. Not one sacrificial victim remained, nor did any of the 1,000 Sun Sorcerers. Countless mortal followers of Magnus were reduced to little more than dust. The shockwaves were so powerful that scores of Space Marines were knocked off their feet, many suffering such severe internal hemorrhaging that they were killed. Battle tanks were flipped in the air, crashing to the ground on their turrets, their crews battered or slain. The Space Marine gunships rushed to the ground to pick up survivors, knowing that if they failed to evacuate the battlefield now, all would be lost once Magnus's remaining forces regained some kind of order. Many survivors were unable to board, however. Some had been thrown too far away by the blast, while others had been launched into a sea of enemies or trapped inside their vehicles. A small number stood their ground to cover the retreating warriors and gunships, selling their lives dearly to buy their brothers time. The gunships had no choice but to leave them behind and return to the ships in order. The thought of what fate awaited the Space Marines left behind filled those who escaped, Stern, Lazarus, and Drago included, with dread.